Hello. Well, even mainstream media of a sort are finally acknowledging that there is something going horribly wrong in many Western societies. And I came across this page, DW, which I assume is Deutsche Welle, the German mainstream media. It must be their page, their broadcaster. And it says here, what is behind the COVID protests across Europe? I believe they've reached the wrong conclusions, but let's just see what they have to say. As governments introduce stricter measures to curb the latest wave of the pandemic, protests have intensified across the EU. What unites and differentiates the demonstrators, it says here, it asks here. And here you see a very nice, well, a shot of a demonstration and a very nice poster. Somebody said, "Vax, no facts," which I think is quite witty. I approve, even though I'm not quite in the same political bracket as this person. As the number of COVID-19 cases rises across the European Union, many member states are implementing stricter rules to curb the pandemic. And you have to think, why did this happen? In Britain, they're taking their feet off the brakes. And in Germany and France, they're tightening them up. Well, one of the first things I suspect is because they didn't get their act together in time. Let's see, have I got this? Yeah, more or less just in... That's better. It was just cutting the top of my head off, I was afraid. Okay, the European Union really didn't get its act together in time. It, out of spite, said that the AstraZeneca vaccine was not reliable, so frightened people from taking that. Meanwhile, they were short of their own types of vaccine, and so their policy really was a shambles. And it meant that not as many people are vaccinated in the European Union as in Britain. And so in Britain, I suppose the feeling is that you can that you have enough herd immunity. Look, there's a lot of argument about that too, isn't there? But I'm just talking about how the governments feel about it, not whether it's a reality or not. And I suspect that the people in the European Union are starting to get the feeling that it really isn't a reality. It's just an attempt by their governments, principally the French and the German governments, to control them. Which even I have that opinion of, and I'm not the demonstrator type, am I? Measures include mandatory vaccination for certain professions. I think that's truly awful. I think that's just awful. Now, you might do lateral flow tests every so often, that's something else. But mandatory vaccinations, no. Not on. And although it goes very much against the British mindset, and less so against French and German mindsets, even the French and Germans, I suspect, don't like it that much. It's just a matter of your attitude to government, as I have pointed this out before. Under Napoleonic law, which is the basis of both French and German law, in a way, you are allowed to do whatever the government specifically tells you you can do. In Britain, common law has always had the attitude you can do whatever you can do, provided it is not specifically forbidden. So there's a difference in attitude there, isn't there? In one, it's a government that tells you what you can do and you stick to those rules, and in the other, it's a government that doesn't tell you what you can do, it just says what you can't do. And this attitude is what is behind the compulsory vaccinations. It's the attitude, and it's something that in Britain would cause a great deal of revulsion. Absolute, not just resistance, but actual revulsion. However, I'm not saying Britain's perfect. They're doing some dumb stuff here as well. It says here, not everyone is happy with these measures, and across the bloc... Why do they have a llama here? Oh well. Across the bloc, tens of thousands have taken to the streets. But what is behind the protests? So this is what the reporter's saying. They are saying that tens of thousands of people are rebelling, and now they're trying to explain what it is to the sort of people who rely on Deutsche Welle for information. The protesters are particularly irate in Germany and its neighbouring countries. According to Austrian police, in Vienna some 40,000 people recently marched against the lockdown and mandatory vaccination. And actually I would have been amongst them. Definitely I would have been out there. I think mandatory vaccination is a reversal of any civilised sort of government. Last weekend, some 8,000 people took to the streets in Brussels. Things have to be bad when you can get the Brussels people out, the capital of Belgium, and also de facto of the EU. Here too, some of the demonstrators clashed with police. In Luxembourg, protesters stormed a Christmas market that was blocked for everyone not vaccinated. I saw the video of that. You had all these people outside the market, and there were these metal stand-up barriers that police put up there. And there were people, just men mostly, they were just lifting the barriers and chucking them out the way, and then people flooded in, and I thought, good for you, good for you. Similar protests have escalated in the Netherlands too. Just a few weeks ago, hundreds of people set bikes on fire in The Hague. Burning bikes! Goodness me, things are bad. And threw stones and other projectiles at police. And that, I want to say that's really serious. I mean, I'm not joking now. When the people in the Netherlands start throwing stones at the police, I'd say that was really serious. I mean, serious, apart from the damage to the police, I mean, really serious from the point of view of the people's attitude to the police. In Germany, there have been protests in a number of regions, for instance, in the German state of Saxony, where large gatherings are currently banned. People have been going on walks. Organised. Now, this is where the article takes a turn for the worse. These walks are organised by far-right groups. The problem with those words, far-right, is that people are called far-right. I think people like Brett Weinstein is now called far-right. Oh, Jordan Peterson certainly has been characterised as far-right. And that's complete nonsense. When you read far-right anywhere, my suggestion is for you to substitute in your mind the sentence, these are people I don't like. That's what far-right means now. People of whom I disapprove. People whom I will say, about whom I will say they're racist, homophobic and Islamophobic. I mean, those three are the trinity that go together. And without knowing anything about them, I will say that. Racist, homophobic and Islamophobic. They have no proof of the political or personal opinions of these far-right people, but that's the basket that they've been chucked into. Okay, so the walks have been organised by far-right groups. There is no doubt that some right-ward groups, running from middle to, swivel-eyed nutcases, will be capitalising on the authoritarianism that they know people are getting fed up of. So, remember, far-right means all the things of which the left, or at least the mainstream media, disapprove. So they will use far-right to mean people I don't like, and then on whom they will project all their own prejudices, which they're suppressing within themselves, but there's like steam in a kettle, you have to let it out somewhere. So you call these people the basket of deplorables, you know, racist, homophobic, Islamophobic, misogynistic, yeah. And these are, but you know, I used to work for the BBC. I saw all of this stuff in the BBC, but disguised and elided. But that's how I know about the way the left and the mainstream media think. Most of them are very prejudiced, but they like to pretend they're the nice guys, so they project everything onto anyone they don't like, and then they call them far right, and that's the basket. The words, the far right, that's the basket into which they put all these labels, you know, misogynistic, homophobic. That's in their minds. Okay, so people have been going on walks organised by far-right groups, or some of them may be, but others may be just a little right of centre, or maybe even centre, depending on who was writing this. Last Friday, protesters gathered with torches, oh, that's always a bad sign, outside the private home of the health minister of the state of Saxony. Oh, I do hope they weren't threatening him. That's not nice. The protests against the COVID... Oh, OK, so it says here, from evangelicals to hooligans, which is an interesting header, isn't it? The protests against the COVID measures seem to draw an eclectic mix of people. Right, so this is it. They say the far right, and then in the very next sentence, they say they are an eclectic mix, which means they realise that they aren't a homogenous bunch of fascists. Right? Eclectic mix of people. The politically disenchanted, you know, that could be anybody. I'm politically disenchanted. So that immediately rules everything out. And Jeremy Corbyn is politically disenchanted, for goodness sake. Those who are anti-state... Yeah, well, what do they mean by anti-state? Nobody is anti-state. I mean, there are one or two anarchists that might be. But most people are anti-big state. And then Deutsche Welle here has, I'm assuming, I hope it is Deutsche Welle, DW here are saying anti-state without any other qualification. So here they mean people who have no sense of structure and order. You know, I'm sorry, but Germans have a very profound sense of order. Okay, who are anti-state. Others who are esoteric, I don't know what that means. I mean, esoteric doesn't mean anything in this context. And, or anti-vaxxers. Yeah, all right, so there will be some of those. But you see how they've got the whole lot, and yet this all comes under the umbrella of far right. Meaning, I have to remind you, I do not approve of these people. That's what those words mean now. On German public broadcaster ZDF, political science professor Mark Hoger, sorry, Professor Hoger, if I'm mispronouncing that. If he's Dutch, that will be Huger, wouldn't it? Anyway, at the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium. Oh, all right. It's Huger. Compared the demonstration in Belgium with France's Yellow Vest movement, seeing a combination of very different social groups which all have their own motivations. So here he's saying it's a disparate group of people with different opinions, and yet it goes as far right, according to how this report primed the story. The situation in Germany is similar. What unites them is frustration, not only with COVID-19 policies, but also with democracy, with political institutions. In anthroposophist circles, anti-modern attitudes are also playing a role. Sociologist Johannes Kies from the University of Siegen in Germany told DW, "What we have seen everywhere is that actors from the political right are at the helm." There, we're back to the right again. And yet previously you just mentioned there are anti-statists, and you can't get more left than that. And what else did it say? Disenchanted. Does that make them far right? No, but they're using that word. From the political right are at the helm, organising and mobilising. He rejected, though, the argument that the far right had hijacked the protest. Well, at least there's that much sense. But look how many times they've used the word far right. So if you're not really concentrating and if you're not really listening, you're getting this far right, far right, far right, which is polluting the way you think about these protests. They were there from the start and none of the other protesters seemed to mind. Okay, so yeah, they're all in for it. No, this is strictly, well, here the COVID protests are strictly one issue thing. COVID, that's it. Protests against lockdowns and restrictions. And it's not that the protesters don't mind, it's that they are concentrating on one issue. Amid the demonstrators in Vienna were members of the far-right, so-called identitarian movement, and the website of the far-right Freedom Party, far-right again, sorry, Freedom Party of Austria has been promoting the rallies. There is also support for the protests from members of the ultra-conservative Catholic community. It always depends on the context and a country's political culture, said Kies. In the Netherlands, for example, evangelical Christians had protested, but so had hooligans, and neither of these are probably far right. This is not happening in other countries in this form. So what they are actually saying here is that a whole lot of different people with different opinions, all of them coming together on just one issue. They don't like what's happening surrounding the COVID restrictions. It's not far right. And if the governments were a bit more sensible, then they would look to the people so that they don't get forced towards the far right to give them a voice for their doubts about all that's going on here. It says here, what are they? There are also huge differences. According to a University of Basel study, the roots of the protests in southwest Germany are in the left-wing alternative movement, whereas in East Germany, the demonstrators are often members of the Alternative for Germany. That's supposed to be a right-wing, well, it is a right-wing organisation. So you have left here, they say, in the West, that would be Stuttgart, wouldn't it? You notice I've spent time in Stuttgart because I say Stuttgart and not Stuttgart. Anyway, so there they have a left-wing movement against COVID, and in East Germany, which would be Bavaria, wouldn't it, there'd be a right-wing one, which sort of figures because the West Southern Germany are far more laid back than in Bavaria. But here you have the same thing happening. Here we have two wings, political wings, and yet this article just talks about the far right as an umbrella for these protests. Basically, it's always about much, much more than Corona, explained Kies. In France, he said the demonstrations were only superficially linked to pandemic measures. It was always about Macron and his style of politics. In the Netherlands, too, protests were linked to criticism of the government's social policies. And there is zero, and so here we have finally worked our way to the heart of this message. There's zero trust in politicians. And that's the top and bottom of it. Nothing to do with far right or far left or anti-vaxxers or anti-lockdowns or anything. It's to do with the fact that people don't trust politicians anymore. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Graniopteryx design or Grambo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.graniopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share, share, share.